Lectures on the Basics of Biblical Greek, Chapter 28. We are in the midst of our discussion of participles, the most flexible part of speech in Hellenistic Greek. Let's review a bit about participles and then the present adverbial participle before we move on to the aorist adverbial participle today. Participles, as we've noted before, are built on a verb. They start with an unaugmented tense stem, typically add a participle morpheme to indicate mood and voice, and finish with a case ending. There are, of course, connecting vowels that can intervene. In this color-coded chart, one can see the four parts. The present stem in white, a connecting vowel in blue, the participle morpheme, nu tau, in yellow, and then the 3-1-3 case endings. Admittedly, in the feminine, it's hard to see the nu tau, but apparently when the alpha was added, there was some sort of consonantal form, and it caused some changes, and we get the usa participle morpheme in the feminine. For the student of these forms, memorizing on, usa, on, ontos, uses, ontos, provides the key to parsing the rest of the present active participle. The participle morpheme for the present middle passive participle is mena, mene, and it is quite obvious in the forms presented in this chart. The forms are 2-1-2 in their case endings. So memorizing amanase on is a good way of recalling the present middle passive participles. How does one work with a present adverbial participle once the forms are recognized? Let's recall that the present participle uses a present tense stem and describes continuous action. Adverbial participles are recognized because they have no article. And adverbial participles give the circumstances under which verbal action takes place in the main clause, or sometimes even called circumstantial participles. These participles will agree with a noun equivalent in case, gender, and number. That noun equivalent gives the subject of the participial action. If the participle is active in form, the word it modifies does the acting. If the participle is passive in form, the word modified receives the action of the participle. With this brief review in place, we now turn to the aorist participle. In this lesson, we're going to start with a lot of forms, the first aorist participle forms, the second aorist participle forms. Then we'll switch to talking about how aorist adverbial participles function and look at some examples, some stems. We'll talk a bit about relative time and make a passing note about the 12 future participles that do exist in the New Testament, although we're not going to study future participles in any substantive way. The first aorist participle forms. The item of note in forming aorist participles is, although the aorist active tense stem is used, the augment has to be removed first. Then a tense formative is added, the active participle morpheme, nu tau, and the case endings according to the 3-1-3 pattern. It's rather hard to see all four parts in the nominative singular, since in the nominative masculine singular, the sigma of the third declension causes the nu tau to drop out. In the nominative feminine singular, those same changes we saw with the present, caused by the adding of an alpha plus something, lead to the result of sasa and the nu tau disappearing. And in the neuter nominative singular, since there is no third declension ending, and the tau cannot stand at the end of the form, it drops out, leaving the bare form lisan. In the genitive singular, it's easier to see all four parts. the unaugmented aorist active stem, the tense formative, sigma alpha, the nu tau, or its equivalent, and then the 3-1-3 case endings. Recall that the alpha changes to eta in the genitive and dative of the first declension, except after epsilon, iota, or rho. We're following sigma, so we get the change. Having identified the nominative and genitive singulars, the rest of the forms flow naturally according to the 3-1-3 pattern. For these first aorist active participles, the student is advised to memorize these two lines, sas, sasa, san, to identify the nominative singulars, and santos, sase, santos, to identify the genitive singulars, and from those forms, the rest of the forms of the first aorist active participle. The first aorist middle participle is formed similarly with an unaugmented aorist active tense stem, a tense formative, but in this particular case, the middle passive participle morpheme is used, followed by the case endings according to the 2-1-2 pattern. In the first aorist middle, it's quite easy to see the four parts: unaugmented stem, tense formative, participle morpheme, and then the case endings according to the 2-1-2 pattern, which are presented here. Genitives are no surprise, and with those in mind, the rest of the forms follow patterns that we've memorized before. Again, the key to identify the aorist middle participle of the first pattern is the presence of the sigma alpha, shown here in blue. Again, the student is advised to memorize 6 forms: samanos, samane, samanon, samanu, samane, samanu, as a way of remembering how the present middle participle is formed of the first aorist. By now we're becoming quite familiar with these patterns. The first aorist passive participle uses an unaugmented aorist passive tense stem from the 6th principal part. The tense formative is theta epsilon, not theta eta. Because it's already passive with the theta epsilon, the active participle morpheme is used, nu tau, and the case endings are according to the 3-1-3 pattern. And as has occurred with other 3-1-3 patterns, the nominative masculine, feminine, and neuter singulars are the hardest in which to see the parts. I provided an explanation under lethes to note how the nu tau drops out after a sigma is added, leaving thes, and to compensate for that droppage, the thes lengthens to thes. Also of note with these first aorist passive participles is that the accents are not recessive into the stem. So although one might expect lethes, the actual form is lethes. And likewise, one would expect lethesa, but instead the form is lethesa with a circumflex because we count short for the alpha, and then we're going to go back 1-2, but we can't because it doesn't go recessively into the stem, and so a long vowel gets a circumflex. So watch the accents on the aorist passives. In the genitive singular, the 4 parts are quite visible, but again notice the accent is not fully recessive. It stops at the theta epsilon or the theta epsilon iota. Building out the rest of the chart is as expected. Again, please note, the accents are not fully recessive, but stop with the syllable that contains the tense formative, theta epsilon. The 6 forms to memorize for the first aorist passive participle are thes, thesa, then, thentos, theses, thentos. By way of review, let's look at the pieces to commit to memory for ease in parsing these forms. The first aorist active, sas, sasasan, santos, sase, santos. The first aorist middle, samanos, samene, samenon, samenu, samenes, samenu. And the first aorist passive, thes, thesathen, thentos, theses, thentos. If you can see the tense formatives and notice the indications of participles, the rest of the parsing goes rather easily. Now we do another set, the second aorist participial forms. What's good about these forms is that they are identical to the present. The only difference is the use of an unaugmented aorist stem. We had something similar happening when we did second aorist indicatives. It's quite easy to learn these forms because we learn nothing new except a different stem. So the second aorist active participle uses the unaugmented aorist active tense stem, connecting vowel, participle morpheme, nu tau, 313 case endings. Looking carefully, balon, balusa, balon, balontos, baluses, balontos. The participial endings, that is, connecting vowel, nu tau, 313, are identical to the present. The only difference is the accents are not recessive into the stem. But since the stem is an aorist stem, not a present stem, it's easy to tell that these are aorist active participles of the second pattern. The whole chart is now before you, built out very similar to the present active participle. They've been learned before. It's a good time to review. On, usa, on, ontos, uses, ontos. The aorist middle of the second pattern, unaugmented aorist active tense stem, connecting vowel, participle morpheme, men, 212. Here the forms look identical to the present middle passive participle, except for the use of an aorist stem. The whole chart shows that reality. The 6 to memorize: amenas, amene, amenon, amenu, amenes, amenu. The second aorist passive participle, we've had second aorist passives before, they just don't have the theta. So these will be identical to the first aorists with the theta missing. So unaugmented aorist passive tense stem, a tense formative of epsilon, not theta epsilon. The active participle morpheme, because the passive is conveyed by the tense formative, and the case endings 313. Graphes, graphesa, graphen, graphentos, grapheses, graphentos. And again, as with other aorist passives, the accents are not recessive into the stem. The whole chart follows logically from the first 2 lines. For memorization, identical to the first aorist passive without the theta. Ace, asa, en, entos, aces, entos. Before you are the 9. The first 2 sets, the active and middle, are identical to the present, and the second aorist passive is like the first aorist passive, just without the theta. On, usa, on, ontos, uses, ontos, amenos, amene, amenon, and ace, asa, en, entos, aces, entos. The lesson so far has been all about forms, and to a degree, this plethora of forms ends up becoming confusing. Still, we must figure out how to work with an aorist adverbial participle. How does it function? How does one translate it? Some basics. Obviously, an aorist participle uses an aorist tense stem, and an aorist participle describes undefined action. The action happens or happened, depending on the time of the main verb. As we noted before, adverbial participles have no articles, and so adverbial participles give circumstances under which verbal action takes place. Aorist adverbial participles agree with the noun equivalent also, in case, gender, and number. If the participle is active, the word it modifies does the action. If the participle is passive, the word modified receives the action of the participle. So, when it's time to translate, question number 1 is aspect. If the form is based on an aorist stem, the form is an aorist participle and should convey undefined action, getting its time from the main verb. The participle morpheme helps with voice by indicating if the participle is active, middle, or passive, or possibly deponent. The lexical form provides the basic meaning. With this guidance in mind, let's turn to some examples. Hopos kago elthon proskineso auto. So that also I, having come, might worship him. The words of Herod the Great. The unaugmented aorist stem loses its eta, becomes an epsilon. The own ending indicates it's a participle, so we have a second aorist active participle agreeing with the subject I, providing the circumstances under which the I might come to, or might worship him. That is, after coming, or having come. Elthonti de eistain oikian pros eilthon auto hoi tifloi. The blind men came to him after he entered into the house. The adverbial participle is again second aorist. It's dative. Notice the new tau followed by the T, so it agrees with auto. The auto, the one to whom the blind men came, is the subject of the participial action. So the blind men came to him after he entered into the house. Hoi de Pharisaioi accusantes epon. When they heard, the Pharisees said. Accusantes is a first aorist active participle. Notice the sigma alpha in the middle, the new tau indicating a participle. It's adverbial, no article in front of it, so it gives the circumstances under which the Pharisees spoke or said. That is, when they heard or after they heard. Andres pharontes epiklines anthropon. The men, after bringing a man on a mat, and the rest of the sentence continues. Pharontes introduces a participial clause that indicates the circumstances under which the men, the subject of this sentence, did whatever is the action of the sentence later on. So, after bringing a man upon a mat, the men did something. Eilthen hochwios tu anthropu estheon kai pinon. I threw this example in because you might be tempted to parse estheon or pinon as aorist participles because of the own ending. No, these are present participles. The key for distinguishing present from second aorist participles, like elthon in the first example, is the stem. Present participles use present stems. Aorist participles use aorist stems. The Son of Man came, eating and drinking. Seeing the stems. Because aorist participles remove the augment from the aorist stem, it can sometimes be a little difficult recognizing or finding the lexical form from the aorist participle. These are some classic examples that cause confusion for students. Agagon is from agagon, the third principal part of ago. Aras is from iro. Idon is the second aorist participle of horao. Adon has lost part of its augment, yielding id, to which the participial ending is added. Elthon comes from aelthon in erkomai. Heron comes from heron, the aorist of heurisco. Thelesos is the aorist participle from thelo. And apon is the second aorist participle of lego. Interestingly, in this particular case, unlike adon, apon maintains the full diphthong in the unaugmented form too. So it's easier to identify. But it is unaugmented, even though one can't see any change. Ah, yes, this can be confusing. A couple of final notes, a bit on relative time. In our previous lesson, we learned the present participle and used the while helping word to translate temporal clauses. That's because the present participle conveys continuous action at the same time as the main verb. Of course, one can just do that by adding ing to a verb. However, the aorist participle is undefined action that typically occurs before the main verb, and so quite often the helping word after is used with aorist participles. It's hard to do an aorist participle with just an ing. Future participles. We're not going to learn the future participles because future participles are disappearing in Hellenistic Greek, and to be honest, there are only 12 of them in the New Testament. But it's not hard to figure them out when one sees them. For example, soson, clearly we're using an on usa on ending, but sozo is first aorist, so that sigma is not the sigma alpha of the aorist stem. Sosas, rather, it's the sigma of the future stem to which the participial ending that we used for the present is added. It's easier to see with the contract verb proskineo, where the epsilon is lengthened to an eta, the sigma is added, but again, not a first aorist participial ending. What looks like a present participial ending, that's the giveaway that it's a future. Genesamenon, ganao, again, would take a first aorist if it were an aorist participle. However, we have an omicron, not an alpha vowel, so it has to be a future. The easiest one to see is lalethesamenon, because the theta eta sigma declares future passive. Admittedly, this is a long lesson with lots of forms. The forms, however, once one learns those basic patterns, use familiar endings that we've had before. The key difference with aorist adverbial participles is that they're undefined action and that they are typically time before the main verb. With that in mind, I commend you to the practice sessions and the translations.